The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor the moment Daniel Hart said the words nobody expected. Every head at the engagement party turned toward him. His best friend Oliver stood frozen with his arms still around his new fiancée, his mouth open in shock. Daniel had just announced, in front of 200 guests, that love was the biggest lie people told each other for money, comfort, or fear of being alone. The room went silent. Then someone laughed, thinking it was a joke. Daniel did not laugh. His eyes were cold, fixed on the crowd of people who had built their entire lives around romantic promises he no longer believed in. He had watched his own parents perform a marriage for 30 years while hating each other in private. He had watched his last relationship end the moment his bank account was threatened by a lawsuit. Love, to him, was a transaction dressed up in flowers and rings. Oliver pulled him aside near the balcony, his voice sharp with embarrassment. "You just ruined my engagement party." "I'm telling the truth," Daniel said. "You think Emily loves you? She loves your name. She loves what you can give her." "That's not fair." "Prove me wrong then." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Walk up to any woman in this city, propose to her tomorrow, and see how fast she says yes. Watch how fast the love appears once she sees the ring is real." Oliver stared at him, disgusted, but also curious. "You really believe that?" "I know it." "Then prove it yourself," Oliver said, his voice suddenly sharp with challenge. "Walk up to a stranger, not someone from our world, someone ordinary. Propose. See if she says yes for you, or for your money." The dare hung in the air like smoke. Daniel should have laughed it off. Instead, something cold and reckless settled into his chest. He needed to prove he was right, not just to Oliver, but to himself, because somewhere underneath the anger was an old wound he refused to look at directly. "Fine," Daniel said. "Give me a name." Oliver, still furious, glanced around the room until his eyes landed on the flower arrangements decorating every table. Roses, peonies, and white orchids spilled from crystal vases, more beautiful than anything Daniel had noticed all evening. "The flowers," Oliver said. "Find out who arranged them. Propose to her." The florist's card was tucked into the largest bouquet near the entrance. Grace Bennett, Bennett's Blooms, a small shop 3 streets from the harbor. Daniel memorized the address without saying another word, walked out of the party, and did not look back. The next morning, the bell above the flower shop door rang softly as Daniel stepped inside. The smell of lilies and fresh soil filled the air. Sunlight came through wide windows and landed on buckets of tulips, daisies, and sunflowers arranged in careful rows. Behind the counter, a woman with warm brown curls and a soft, curvy figure was trimming stems with quick, practiced hands. She wore a green apron dusted with pollen and did not look up right away. "Be with you in 1 second," she said, focused on the flowers in front of her. Daniel studied her. She was nothing like the polished, thin, calculated women who usually filled his world. Her hands were rough from work. Her laugh, when a coworker said something from the back room, was loud and unguarded. She looked like someone who had never once performed happiness for an audience. "I need to speak with the owner," Daniel said. She finally looked up, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's me, Grace Bennett." Her eyes moved over his expensive coat, his watch, the confident way he stood, like he owned every room he entered. "You don't look like someone who needs flowers." "I don't need flowers," Daniel said. "I need a wife." Grace blinked, waiting for the joke. When his expression did not change, she let out a short laugh. "I'm sorry. What?" "My name is Daniel Hart. I own the Hart Grand Hotel chain. I am offering you a marriage contract. 1 year, maybe 2. In exchange, I will pay off any debt you have, provide a monthly allowance, and give you a life most people only dream about." Grace set down her scissors slowly, staring at him like he had lost his mind. "Are you filming something? Is this a prank?" "I am completely serious." "You walked into my shop and proposed to a stranger." "Yes." "Why?" Daniel hesitated for half a second, deciding how much truth to give her. "Because I want to prove that love is not real, that people only commit for security, status, or money. You seem like someone with practical reasons to say yes." Grace's face changed, the warmth draining into something sharper. "You think I'm desperate. I think everyone has a price." She crossed her arms, and for a moment, Daniel thought she would throw him out of the shop. Instead, something in her eyes shifted, calculating, careful. "My father is sick," she said quietly, the words costing her something to admit. "His treatment isn't covered by insurance. I've been trying to keep this shop open and pay his medical bills at the same time, and I'm failing at both." She looked at Daniel directly, refusing to be ashamed. "So yes, I have a price, but it's not what you think. Name it." "You don't get to walk in here and treat me like an experiment," Grace said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability underneath it. "If I agree to this, you treat me with respect. Not as a prop for your bet, not as an accessory for your parties. I keep my shop. I keep my name. And when this contract ends, I walk away with my dignity intact." Daniel had expected tears, excitement, or greedy calculation. He had not expected conditions. "Agreed," he said, surprised at how easily the word left his mouth. "I need 3 days to think about it." "You have one." Grace studied him for a long moment, sizing up the stranger standing in her shop offering to rearrange her entire life. Behind her, unseen, her coworker Lily peeked around the corner, eyes wide with disbelief. Grace ignored her. "Fine," Grace said. "One day." That evening, Daniel found himself doing something he never did, waiting. He paced his penthouse office, staring at the city lights, wondering if the woman with flower dust on her hands and fire in her eyes would actually say yes. Some small, buried part of him hoped she would say no, just to prove there was one person left who couldn't be bought. Another part of him, colder and more familiar, was certain money always won in the end. At exactly 6 the next evening, Grace walked into the lobby of the Hart Grand Hotel, wearing a simple blue dress, her curls pulled back, her chin lifted like she was walking into a business meeting rather than a proposal. Daniel watched her cross the marble floor, unbothered by the wealth surrounding her, unimpressed by the chandelier above her head. "I've decided," Grace said, stopping in front of him. "I'll marry you. For my father, not for you." Something tightened in Daniel's chest that he refused to name. "Understood. I have conditions beyond what I already said. Go on. No public displays unless necessary for your image. No pretending in private when it's just us. And you don't get to look down on me because I didn't grow up with money like you did." Daniel almost smiled. "Careful, Miss Bennett. Demands like that could make a man think you actually have a spine." "I have more than a spine," Grace said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I have a shop full of flowers I built myself, and a father who needs me to survive this. Don't confuse kindness for weakness." That night, Daniel arranged a quiet dinner at a small restaurant away from photographers, wanting to discuss the contract details privately. Grace arrived straight from the shop, faint traces of soil still under her fingernails, and made no apology for it. She ordered simply, spoke honestly about her father's illness, and laughed once, unexpectedly, at something the waiter said, a laugh so genuine it caught Daniel off guard. "You're not what I expected," Daniel admitted halfway through the meal. "You expected someone easier to control. I expected someone who wanted this for the money." "I do want it for the money," Grace said plainly. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. My father's life depends on it. But that doesn't mean I'll let you treat me like I don't matter." Daniel found himself watching her hands as she spoke, animated and unguarded, nothing like the careful, rehearsed gestures of the women in his world. For the first time in years, he felt slightly unsteady, like the ground beneath his certainty had shifted an inch. 2 days later, the contract was signed in a lawyer's office, cold and businesslike. Grace read every line twice before putting her signature down, refusing to be rushed, even as Daniel's assistant hovered nearby with a schedule to keep. When she finally signed, she looked up at Daniel with a steady, unreadable expression. "This doesn't make you right about love," she said. "It just makes me desperate enough to gamble." "We'll see," Daniel replied. Word of the sudden engagement spread through Daniel's circle within hours. Oliver called him immediately, stunned. "You actually did it. You actually proposed to a stranger." "I told you I would." "Daniel, this isn't a joke anymore. You're about to marry someone you don't know." "That's the point," Daniel said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I'm going to prove that even the most ordinary person says yes for the right price. And when this ends in a year, everyone will finally understand what I've been saying all along." Oliver was quiet for a moment. "And if you're wrong?" Daniel had no answer for that. Across the city, Grace sat in her father's hospital room, holding his frail hand, explaining what she had done in the softest voice she could manage. Her father, weak but sharp-eyed, studied her carefully. "You don't love this man," he said. "No," Grace admitted. "Then why?" "Because I refuse to lose you over money I don't have," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly before she steadied it. "This is temporary, a business arrangement, nothing more." Her father squeezed her hand weakly. "Be careful, Gracie. Money changes people. Don't let it change you." "It won't," Grace promised, though a small, uncertain voice inside her wondered if that promise would be harder to keep than she expected. That night, alone in her small apartment above the flower shop, Grace stared at the ceiling, replaying the strange turn her life had taken. A stranger had walked in and offered to solve her worst problem, and all it would cost her was pretending to be his wife for a while. It should have felt simple. Instead, something about the intensity in Daniel's eyes when he spoke about love being fake unsettled her, like he was daring the world to prove him wrong, and secretly hoping someone finally would. Across town, Daniel stood at his window, staring out at the city he had built his empire in, waiting for the satisfaction of winning his bet to settle in. It did not come. Instead, all he could think about was the steady, unshaken look in Grace Bennett's eyes when she told him not to confuse her kindness for weakness. For the first time in years, Daniel Hart was not entirely sure what he had just started. The wedding took place on a gray Saturday morning, with barely 30 guests, a ceremony so quiet it felt more like a business merger than a marriage. Grace wore a simple ivory dress she had chosen herself, refusing the designer gowns Daniel's assistant tried to push on her. She carried a small bouquet of white ranunculus, flowers she had grown and arranged with her own hands the night before, because she refused to let anyone else touch the one part of the day that still belonged to her. Daniel's mother, Eleanor Hart, sat in the front row with her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. She had met Grace exactly once before the ceremony, a 15-minute conversation in which she asked pointed questions about Grace's family, her education, and her bank account, clearly searching for evidence to confirm her suspicions. "She's after his money," Eleanor whispered to her sister during the vows. "Look at her, a florist. He could have had anyone." Grace did not hear the comment, but she felt the weight of the stares throughout the ceremony, the quiet judgment radiating from every well-dressed guest who could not understand why Daniel Hart, heir to a hotel empire, would marry an ordinary woman with flour and pollen permanently embedded under her fingernails. When the officiant pronounced them married, Daniel leaned down and kissed her briefly, a kiss meant only for the cameras his publicist had arranged to control the story before gossip columns could invent their own version. Grace kept her eyes open the entire time, refusing to pretend this was anything more than what it was. The reception was small and stiff, held in a private room at the Hart Grand Hotel. Grace moved through the crowd of Daniel's business associates and society friends, answering the same questions over and over. "How did you two meet? How long have you been together? What was the proposal like?" She gave vague, practiced answers, watching Daniel do the same across the room, both of them performing a story neither believed. Later that night, Grace was moved into Daniel's estate on the edge of the city, a sprawling property with more rooms than she could count, and a garden that had clearly once been beautiful, but was now overgrown and neglected. Daniel showed her to her own wing of the house, separate from his, without explanation. "The staff will help you settle in," he said, already turning to leave. "There's a car available if you need to visit the shop. My assistant will forward any public appearances you need to attend." "That's it?" Grace asked. "No conversation about how this actually works?" Daniel paused in the doorway. "What is there to discuss? We live our separate lives. We show up together when required. In a year, we end this, and you walk away with everything promised in the contract. And until then? Until then, try to enjoy the house," Daniel said, and left without another word. Grace stood alone in the enormous room, staring at furniture that cost more than she used to make in a year, feeling smaller and more out of place than she had ever felt in her life. She thought of her small apartment above the flower shop, cramped but warm, filled with the smell of fresh soil and cut stems. This house, for all its grandeur, felt cold and hollow, like nobody who lived here had ever truly been happy. The following morning, Grace woke early out of habit and wandered the halls until she found the garden Daniel had walked her past the night before. In daylight, it was even worse than she remembered. Weeds choking what had once been rose beds, dead branches littering the walkways, a fountain dry and cracked in the center. Something about the neglect bothered her more than the cold reception she had received from Daniel's mother. She found the head housekeeper, a stern but kind woman named Margaret, and asked permission to work in the garden. "That's not your job, dear," Margaret said gently. "You're the lady of the house now." "I don't know how to be that," Grace admitted, "but I know how to grow things. Please, let me try." Margaret studied her for a long moment, surprised by the request, then nodded slowly. "I'll have the groundskeeper bring you tools." For the next several weeks, while Daniel disappeared into meetings and business trips, Grace spent her mornings in the garden, pulling weeds, replanting flower beds, coaxing life back into soil that had been abandoned for years. Word spread through the household staff, and soon Margaret was bringing her tea in the mornings. The groundskeeper was teaching her about the estate's old irrigation system, and even the usually silent chef, a man named Peter, began setting aside fresh herbs for her to plant. Grace did not try to change herself to fit into Daniel's world. She wore practical clothes in the garden, laughed loudly when something amused her, and treated every member of the household staff with the same warmth she gave to customers at her flower shop. Slowly, without meaning to, she became the most well-liked person on the entire estate. Not because of her new title, but because of who she had always been. Daniel noticed the change in the household before he noticed the change in himself. He came home one evening to find the front hall filled with fresh flowers arranged in vases that had sat empty for years. He found Margaret humming while she worked, something he had never heard before. He found the groundskeeper smiling as he described the roses that were finally blooming again after seasons of neglect. "What happened to the garden?" Daniel asked Margaret one evening, genuinely curious. "Your wife happened to it," Margaret said, unable to hide her fondness. "She's been out there every morning since she arrived. Doesn't ask for anything. Doesn't complain about the work, just shows up and gives it everything she has." Daniel found Grace in the garden that same evening, kneeling in the dirt, planting something small and green, her hair loose and messy, completely unaware he was watching her. For a long moment, he simply stood there, unsettled by how at ease she looked, how genuinely happy, in a place that had brought him nothing but silence his entire childhood. "You didn't have to do any of this," Daniel said finally, announcing his presence. Grace looked up, unsurprised to see him. "I wanted to. This garden deserved better than being forgotten. Most people in your position would spend their time shopping, attending parties, enjoying the money. I'm not most people," Grace said simply, returning her attention to the soil. "And I don't need your money to feel useful. I need something to do with my hands, or I go a little crazy." Daniel watched her for another moment, an unfamiliar feeling settling into his chest, something between admiration and confusion. He had married her expecting greed, expecting someone who would spend his fortune the moment she got access to it. Instead, she was out here every day, working for nothing, asking for nothing. "There's a gala next week," Daniel said abruptly, changing the subject to something safer. "My family expects us to attend together. It will be the first real test of how convincing we are as a couple." Grace sat back on her heels, studying him. "Your mother already hates me. What difference does one gala make?" "My mother doesn't hate you. She's cautious. She's seen people marry into this family for the wrong reasons before. And you've already told her I'm one of them." Daniel did not answer, which was answer enough. "Fine," Grace said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "I'll play my part at your gala. But don't expect me to pretend I'm someone I'm not. If your family can't handle a woman with dirt under her nails, that's not my problem to fix." The gala arrived a week later, A glittering event filled with Daniel's business partners, society families, and journalists eager for photographs of the mysterious florist who had captured the interest of the notoriously cold Daniel Hart. Grace wore a deep green gown that complemented her curves rather than hiding them, refusing every suggestion from Daniel's stylist to choose something more conservative. "This is who I am," Grace told the stylist firmly. "Either people accept that, or they don't. I'm not shrinking myself for one night." Daniel, watching from across the room as she descended the staircase, felt something shift in his chest he was not prepared to name. She looked confident, radiant, completely herself, nothing like the nervous, out-of-place woman he had expected to attend his family's event. Throughout the evening, Grace navigated the crowd with unexpected grace, engaging genuinely with people, rather than performing polite small talk. She spoke with an elderly businessman about his rose garden for 20 minutes, charmed a notoriously difficult journalist by simply being honest about her background instead of hiding it, and even managed to make Daniel's stern aunt laugh for the first time in years. Eleanor Hart watched her son's wife move through the crowd with growing unease, not because Grace was doing poorly, but because she was doing remarkably well, and Eleanor had expected an easy target to dismiss, not a woman who refused to be intimidated by wealth she had not been born into. "She's clever," Eleanor said quietly to Daniel later that evening, cornering him near the bar. "I'll give her that. But cleverness doesn't mean sincerity. Watch yourself, Daniel." "I know what I'm doing," Daniel said, though the certainty in his voice felt thinner than it used to. Later that night, driving home in silence, Grace finally spoke. "Your mother thinks I'm manipulating you." "My mother thinks everyone is manipulating everyone. It's how she survived marrying my father." "Do you think that too?" Daniel glanced at her, the streetlights casting shifting shadows across her face. "I don't know what to think anymore," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Grace turned to look at him, surprised by the honesty. "That's the first true thing you've said to me since we met." Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the drive, but something between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, a crack forming in the careful walls Daniel had built around himself years ago. Grace stared out the window, wondering when exactly she had stopped thinking of this arrangement as simply a way to save her father, and started thinking of it as something else entirely, something she was not ready to name. The phone call came at 11 in the morning, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the quiet rhythm Grace had built for herself over the past 2 months. It was Lily, her assistant at the flower shop, her voice tight with panic. "Grace, you need to come down here, now." "What happened?" "The landlord raised the rent. He's saying if we can't pay double by the end of the month, he's giving the space to someone else. Some new tenant is already offering more." Grace's stomach dropped. The shop had survived on thin margins even before her father's illness drained their savings, and doubling the rent overnight would destroy everything she had spent years building. She grabbed her coat and rushed out of the estate without waiting for a car, hailing a cab instead, desperate to reach the shop before panic completely consumed her. By the time she arrived, Lily was arguing with the landlord in the front room, while customers awkwardly pretended not to listen. The landlord, a heavy-set man named Gerald, held up his hands the moment Grace walked in. "Business is business, Mrs. Hart," he said, his tone shifting the instant he recognized her married name. "Though I suppose money isn't exactly a problem for you anymore, is it?" The comment stung more than Grace expected. "This shop is mine. I built it before I married anyone. Don't treat it like it's suddenly worthless just because of who I married. Then pay the new rate, or I find someone who will," Gerald said simply, unmoved by her frustration. Grace spent the next hour on the phone with lawyers, trying to understand her options, her hands shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. She could ask Daniel for the money easily. It was nothing compared to what he spent on a single dinner reservation, but something in her refused to do it. This shop was the one thing in her life that still belonged entirely to her, built with her own hands before Daniel Hart had ever walked through its door. Taking his money to save it felt like giving up the last piece of herself that remained untouched by their arrangement. That evening, exhausted and defeated, Grace returned to the estate to find Daniel waiting in the entrance hall, having already heard about the situation from his assistant, who monitored press mentions of anything connected to the Hart name. "Why didn't you call me?" Daniel asked, his voice sharper than intended. Because it's not your problem to fix. You're my wife. Everything that affects you affects this family's image. Grace's temper flared, exhaustion stripping away her patience. So this is about your image again. Not about me, not about the shop I've spent years building. Just about how it looks if the papers find out Daniel Hart's wife lost her business. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, genuinely unsure how to answer. The truth was more complicated than either explanation, a tangled mixture of protecting his reputation and something else entirely, something that had been growing quietly since the night he found her in the garden, unaware and unguarded, more at peace than he had ever seen anyone in this house. I'll handle it, Daniel said finally. I don't want your money. I'm not offering money, Daniel said. I'm offering to buy the building. Grace blinked, caught off guard. What? The building your shop sits in. I'll buy it outright. You become the landlord instead of the tenant. No one raises your rent again, because there's no one left to raise it. That's still your money. It's an investment, Daniel said, his tone carefully neutral, though something flickered behind his eyes that suggested this was about more than business. Property in that district appreciates well. It's a smart financial decision, nothing more. Grace studied him, searching for the lie in his explanation, and finding none. Why does it matter to you? A month ago you barely spoke to me outside of scheduled appearances. Daniel hesitated, the words catching somewhere between his chest and his throat. Because that shop matters to you, he said finally, quietly, and somewhere along the way, I started caring about what matters to you. The admission hung heavy in the air between them, more honest than anything either of them had said since the marriage began. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, dangerous and unexpected, a warmth she had been carefully avoiding since the night of the gala. Don't say things like that if you don't mean them, Grace said softly. I've had enough people in my life pretend to care when it was convenient. I mean it, Daniel said, and for the first time, his voice carried none of the cold calculation she had grown used to. The building purchase was finalized within the week, quiet and unpublicized, exactly how Grace wanted it. She returned to her shop the following Monday to find new paperwork waiting, her name listed as the property owner instead of the tenant, a small but significant shift that changed everything about how secure her future finally felt. But peace never lasted long in Daniel's world. 2 weeks later, a familiar face walked into the Hart Grand Hotel lobby during a business event Grace was required to attend, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a calculating smile that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. Daniel, the woman said, her voice smooth as silk. It's been a long time. Daniel's expression tightened instantly. Victoria. Grace watched the exchange carefully, sensing history in the careful distance between them, in the way Daniel's shoulders squared like he was preparing for battle. This must be your new wife, Victoria said, turning her attention to Grace with an appraising look that lasted a beat too long. How refreshing. I always wondered what type of woman Daniel would settle for once he gave up on real ambition. Victoria, Daniel said again, warning in his tone. I'm only being honest, Victoria continued, unbothered. We were engaged once, you know, before Daniel decided family expectations were more important than the woman he actually loved. Grace felt the weight of the words, though she refused to let her face show it. That sounds like a story between the two of you, she said calmly. It has nothing to do with me. Victoria's smile sharpened, clearly unused to being met with composure instead of insecurity. Careful, dear. Daniel has a habit of choosing convenience over genuine feeling. I would know. Convenient or not, Grace said, holding her ground. He chose me, and unlike some people, I don't need to insult a stranger to feel better about my own past. Something flickered across Victoria's expression, surprise quickly masked with irritation, before she excused herself with a tight smile and disappeared into the crowd. Daniel stared at Grace, something between shock and admiration written across his face. You didn't have to defend yourself like that, he said quietly, once they were alone. I wasn't defending myself, Grace said. I was refusing to let her make me small. There's a difference. Daniel studied her for a long moment, the noise of the party fading into the background. "She's the woman I almost married," he admitted. "Before she left me for my business rival, the moment his company outperformed mine. It's part of why I stopped believing love was ever real to begin with." Grace's expression softened slightly, understanding settling into the space where anger had been. "That explains a lot about you. I don't need pity." "I'm not offering pity," Grace said. "I'm offering understanding. There's a difference between those two." Their conversation was interrupted by Daniel's assistant, rushing over with an urgent expression, whispering something into his ear that made Daniel's face darken instantly. "What's wrong?" Grace asked. "There's been an incident at one of the hotels, a safety violation the press has already gotten hold of. I need to handle this immediately." "Go," Grace said. "I can manage the rest of the evening on my own." Daniel hesitated, something unfamiliar flickering across his expression, reluctance to leave her side that had nothing to do with obligation. "Are you certain?" "I've survived worse than a room full of judgmental strangers," Grace said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Go handle your crisis, Mr. Hart." Daniel left, and for the first time since their marriage began, Grace felt a small pang of something unexpected, watching him disappear into the crowd, worry for a man she had married as nothing more than a business arrangement. She pushed the feeling down immediately, reminding herself of every reason this marriage was supposed to remain temporary, supposed to remain uncomplicated by anything resembling real emotion. But standing alone in that glittering room, surrounded by people who still doubted her place in this world, Grace realized with quiet, unsettling clarity that the walls she had built to protect her heart during this arrangement were beginning to crack, one honest conversation at a time. 3 months into the marriage, Daniel found himself doing something he had not done in years, looking forward to coming home. He caught himself glancing at the clock during business meetings, calculating how quickly he could finish before evening settled in, before he could find Grace in the garden or the kitchen, or wherever her laughter happened to be echoing that day. He noticed the way the house felt different when she was traveling to visit her father, quieter in a way that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He told himself it was simply appreciation for her positive effect on the household, on his family's public image, on the smooth running of the estate. He refused to call it anything deeper, terrified that naming the feeling would mean admitting his entire worldview about love had been wrong from the very beginning. Grace, meanwhile, had stopped pretending to herself that this marriage was purely transactional. She found herself saving small stories to tell Daniel over dinner, noticing when he seemed exhausted from work, and quietly bringing him tea without being asked, feeling a warmth spread through her chest whenever he laughed at something she said, an actual laugh, unguarded and real, nothing like the practiced smile he wore for photographers. One evening, after a long day at the shop, Grace returned to the estate earlier than expected and heard voices coming from Daniel's study. The door was slightly open, and she recognized Oliver's voice mixed with Daniel's, their conversation carrying easily into the hallway. "You still think this whole thing is just a bet?" Oliver was asking, disbelief evident in his tone. Grace froze, her hand still on the doorframe, unable to make herself walk away. "It started as a bet," Daniel's voice replied, tired and unguarded in a way Grace rarely heard. "I'm not going to pretend it didn't." "And now?" There was a long pause before Daniel spoke again. "I don't know what it is now. I know I look forward to seeing her every evening. I know the house feels wrong when she's not in it. But I also know how this began, and I don't know how to reconcile that with whatever I'm feeling now." "Have you told her any of this?" "How would I even start that conversation? Grace, I proposed to you to win a bet, but somewhere along the way, I actually fell for you. So let's pretend the beginning never happened." Grace's chest tightened painfully, the words landing like small, sharp stones. She had known the origin of their marriage since the very first day, had accepted the transactional nature of their arrangement with clear eyes, but hearing him describe it so plainly, still framing everything through the lens of the bet even now, made something inside her collapse quietly, painfully. She turned and walked away before either man noticed her presence, retreating to her room with unsteady steps, her mind replaying every genuine moment she thought they had shared, every laugh, every quiet conversation, every small kindness, now colored with doubt. Had any of it been real, Or had she simply been convenient proof for a bet Daniel still had not fully let go of? That night, Grace barely slept, staring at the ceiling of the room she had grown to think of as home, wondering how she had let herself fall this deeply into an arrangement built on such a fragile, cynical foundation. She thought of the exit clause in their original contract, the option to leave after 6 months, if either party wished to end things early, a clause she had insisted on during the negotiations, back when protecting herself had felt like the most important thing in the world. Over the following days, Grace pulled back without explanation, offering polite, distant responses instead of the warmth Daniel had grown accustomed to. She stopped bringing him tea in the evenings, stopped sharing small stories over dinner, spent longer hours at the shop instead of returning to the estate. Daniel noticed immediately, the change in her demeanor unmistakable, though he had no idea what had caused it. "Did something happen?" Daniel asked one evening, finding her in the garden, though she was not planting anything, simply sitting quietly among the flowers she had brought back to life. "I'm just tired," Grace said, not looking at him. "You've been distant all week." "Have I?" Daniel sat down beside her, close enough to notice the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she kept her eyes fixed on the flower beds instead of him. "Grace, talk to me. Whatever this is, we can figure it out. Can we?" Grace finally turned to look at him, her expression carefully controlled. "Or is this still just an experiment to you? A bet you're waiting to collect on?" Daniel's face paled slightly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You heard the conversation with Oliver." "I heard enough." "Grace, that conversation wasn't the full picture of what I feel." "Wasn't it?" Grace's voice cracked slightly, despite her efforts to remain composed. "You still call it a bet, Daniel. After everything, after 3 months of building something I thought was real, you still frame the beginning of us as some kind of experiment you haven't fully let go of." "Because it started that way," Daniel said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I can't pretend it didn't. But that doesn't mean it's still what it is now. How am I supposed to trust that? How do I know I'm not just convenient proof for whatever point you're still trying to make to your friends?" Daniel reached for her hand, but Grace pulled away, standing quickly, putting distance between them. "I think I need time," she said quietly, "away from all of this. Away from the house, the bet, the contract, all of it." "Grace, I'm not leaving forever," Grace said, though the words felt uncertain even as she spoke them. "I just need to think clearly about what's real and what isn't. About what I actually want, separate from everything this arrangement has wrapped around it." That night, Grace packed a small bag and moved back into her apartment above the flower shop, the space feeling both familiar and foreign after months away. She sat among her plants, surrounded by the scent of soil and fresh stems, trying to untangle her feelings from the fear that she had fallen in love with a man who still, deep down, saw their entire relationship through the lens of a bet he needed to win. Daniel remained at the estate, the house suddenly unbearably quiet without her presence filling its halls. He wandered into the garden she had brought back to life, staring at flowers that had bloomed because of her patience and care, and felt something inside him crack open completely. He thought of every moment since their wedding, every small kindness she had shown him without expecting anything in return, every genuine laugh, every honest conversation, and realized with sudden, devastating clarity that he had fallen in love with his own wife somewhere along the way, and had been too afraid to admit it, even to himself. He found Oliver later that night, showing up unannounced at his friend's apartment, looking more shaken than Oliver had seen him in years. "I think I ruined everything," Daniel admitted, sinking onto the couch without waiting for an invitation. "What happened?" "Grace heard our conversation, the one where I still called our marriage a bet." Oliver winced. "Daniel, you have to fix this." "I don't know how. Every time I try to explain, it sounds like I'm making excuses." "Then stop trying to explain with words," Oliver said. "Show her instead. Actions, not explanations. That's what she needs right now." Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, staring at nothing, replaying every mistake he had made since walking into that flower shop 3 months ago, with nothing but cynicism and a cruel bet motivating him forward. He thought of Grace's steady eyes the first day they met, Her insistence on being treated with respect, her refusal to let anyone, including him, make her feel small. "I have to fix this," Daniel said finally, standing with sudden determination, "before she decides this entire marriage isn't worth saving." "What are you going to do?" Daniel did not answer immediately, his mind already racing through possibilities, desperate to find some way to prove that whatever existed between them now had grown into something far beyond the cruel bet that started it all. He left Oliver's apartment with a single, clear thought guiding him forward, that losing Grace Bennett would be the first real loss he had ever truly feared in his entire life. Grace stood behind the counter of her shop early the next morning, trimming stems with hands that were not quite steady, her mind still tangled in the events of the previous night. Lily watched her carefully from across the room, sensing something was wrong, but wise enough not to push until Grace was ready to talk. The bell above the door rang, and Grace looked up expecting a customer. Instead, she found Eleanor Hart standing in the doorway, dressed impeccably as always, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Hart," Strace said, straightening immediately, bracing herself for another round of pointed questions and thinly veiled accusations. "I heard you moved out of the estate," Eleanor said, without preamble, stepping further into the shop, her eyes moving over the flowers with something that looked almost like appreciation. "News travels fast. In this family, it always does." Eleanor paused near a display of white ranunculus, the same flowers Grace had carried at her wedding. "I owe you an apology." Grace blinked, caught completely off guard. "I'm sorry?" "I spent months assuming you married my son for his money," Eleanor said, her voice carrying none of its usual coldness. "I watched you carefully, waiting for you to slip, waiting for the greed to show itself the way it always has with people who marry into wealth for the wrong reasons. It never came. I told you from the beginning I wasn't like that." "Everyone says that," Eleanor said. "Very few people mean it. You bought that shop back with your own earnings before Daniel ever offered to help. You spent months rebuilding a garden nobody asked you to touch. You defended yourself against Victoria without once mentioning my son's money or status." Eleanor met her eyes directly. "I was wrong about you, Grace Bennett, and I don't say that easily." Grace felt something loosen in her chest, an unexpected comfort in finally being seen clearly by someone who had judged her so harshly from the start. "Thank you for saying that. Whatever happened between you and my son," Eleanor continued, "I hope you find your way back to each other. I have never seen Daniel this alive since before his father and I destroyed his belief in real love with our own miserable marriage. You did that, not the bet. You." Eleanor left as quietly as she had arrived, leaving Grace standing among her flowers, turning the conversation over in her mind, wondering if it was truly too late to salvage what she had built with Daniel, or if the foundation had always been too fractured to survive honest scrutiny. That evening, as Grace prepared to close the shop, the bell above the door rang one final time. She looked up, expecting Lily returning for something she had forgotten, and instead found Daniel standing in the doorway, looking nothing like the composed, confident man who had first walked into her shop 3 months ago. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, and his eyes carried an exhaustion that had nothing to do with business. "We're closed," Grace said automatically, though she made no move to usher him out. "I know," Daniel said. "I'm not here as a customer." Grace crossed her arms, guarding herself against whatever came next. "Then why are you here?" "Because I've spent the last 2 days trying to figure out how to say what I should have said months ago, and I realized there's no perfect way to say it, so I'm just going to say it badly instead." Grace waited, her heart pounding despite her efforts to remain composed. "I married you to win a cruel bet with my friend," Daniel said, the words raw and unpolished. "That's the truth, and I can't erase it no matter how much I wish I could. I walked into your life expecting to prove something cynical and broken, expecting you to confirm every terrible thing I believed about love being fake." He took a step closer. "Instead, you showed up every single day with more honesty and integrity than anyone I've ever known. You never once tried to change who you were, to fit into my world. You fought for your shop with your own hands before ever asking me for help. You defended yourself against my family without needing my money as a shield." "Daniel, let me finish," he said quietly, and Grace fell silent, watching him with cautious, guarded hope. I don't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere between the garden and the gala, and Victoria's cruel comments and every quiet dinner we shared, I stopped seeing you as proof of my bet, and started seeing you as the only real thing in my entire life. I was terrified to admit that, because admitting it meant admitting everything I believed about love being fake was wrong, and admitting I was wrong has never come easily to me. Grace felt tears building despite her best efforts to hold them back. You still called it a bet when you talked to Oliver. Because I was still too afraid to say what I'm saying now, Daniel admitted. But I'm done being afraid. I love you, Grace. Not because you're convenient proof for some cruel argument. Not because my family expects it. I love you because you rebuilt my garden without asking for anything in return. Because you laugh loud enough to fill an entire house that used to feel empty. Because you look at me like I'm a person worth knowing, not a name worth marrying. The shop was silent, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator holding fresh flowers, and Grace stood frozen, letting his words settle into the space where doubt had been living for the past several days. I need to know this is real, Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Not performance. Not proving a point to anyone anymore. Real. Come back to the estate, Daniel said. Not because the contract requires it. Tear up the contract if you want. Marry me again. For real this time. With vows that actually mean something. In front of people who matter, instead of a room full of skeptical strangers. Give me the chance to prove this isn't performance. Grace studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the calculated coldness that had first walked into her shop, and found none of it remaining. What she found instead was a man who had genuinely, painfully, learned to believe in something he had spent years insisting was fake. I'm still angry you called it a bet in front of Oliver, Grace said finally, a small smile beginning to break through her guarded expression. I know. You're going to have to earn my trust back properly, not with grand gestures. With actual time and honesty. I intend to, Daniel said, closing the distance between them, for as long as it takes. The following weeks unfolded slowly, deliberately, both of them rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. Daniel showed up at the shop unannounced, not with expensive gifts, but with simple gestures, helping Lily unload flower deliveries, learning the names of every regular customer, sitting quietly with Grace while she worked, instead of demanding her attention elsewhere. He canceled a business trip to accompany her to her father's medical appointment, holding her hand in the waiting room without needing to be asked. At Daniel's insistence, they held a second wedding 2 months later, small and intimate, nothing like the stiff, performative ceremony that had started their marriage. Grace's father, weak but improving steadily thanks to the treatment his daughter's sacrifice had made possible, walked her down a simple aisle in the estate garden she had brought back to life with her own hands. Eleanor sat in the front row, tears in her eyes, finally witnessing a wedding built on something real instead of calculation. Oliver stood beside Daniel as his best man, grinning as he watched his once cynical friend exchange vows with genuine emotion shining in his eyes, a complete transformation from the bitter man who had made a cruel bet at an engagement party months earlier. I once believed love was nothing more than a performance people gave for money or status, Daniel said during his vows, his voice steady and sure. Grace Bennett walked into my life and proved me wrong every single day, not with grand declarations, but with quiet honesty and unshakable integrity. I don't deserve the love she's given me, but I intend to spend every day earning it anyway. Grace, tears streaming freely down her face, held his hands tightly. I said yes to you for my father, she said, but somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I said yes to you for myself too, not because of your money or your name, because underneath the cynicism, I found someone worth loving. As the sun set over the garden Grace had brought back to life, surrounded by flowers she had planted with her own hands, and people who had finally learned to see her clearly, Daniel Hart understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that everything he once believed about love being fake had been nothing more than the fear of a man who had never truly experienced it, until the curvy flower girl he tried to use for a bet became the only truth he ever needed.